Hey, welcome. It's good to be together. I am back in the office here and kicking off again a re-kickoff of our online virtual Bible study here on Facebook Live, and all of these videos are stored on YouTube on our YouTube player as well. We'll get a link going down there below in a little bit. But hey, it's super great to be together, and we're starting off our study here in the book of Matthew. Let's check it out. Don't forget, this is a How to Read the Bible, a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. And that was maybe a little bit more complicated, a little bit harder when we're in the Old Testament, like Genesis or Leviticus, and like where does Jesus pop up in those? Remember, those videos are on YouTube. Today we're in Matthew, kicking off the New Testament. And so, listen, Jesus is the main character in Matthew, so it's not going to be hard to spot Jesus in Matthew, but there's some of these themes, especially how it relates to the rest of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, that I think are going to be super, super interesting and helpful for us. Let's get into Matthew. First of all, what do you know about Matthew? It's kind of an interesting book because a lot of us know things about Matthew, that's the birth story, one of the more famous ones of Jesus when the Magi come from the east and bring the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to Jesus. Obviously, there's the Herod coming after the little baby boys. That's a common story a lot of people know. There's death and resurrection in all the Gospels. The Great Commission is in this one. But listen, underneath a lot of that, there's some really interesting history going on. So stick with us here as we dig into that. The theme of Matthew is, I called it the brand new life from a long time ago, because it connects so deeply to the Old Testament of the Bible. Let's do a little summary, recap of what we know about Matthew. Kicking off, this is one of the earliest accounts of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That the book is actually anonymous, so we don't ever see that that Matthew claims to be the one that writes it, but so many sources have put this on Matthew that the title of the book became known as the Gospel, the Good News, according to Matthew. So it's ascribed to him. Matthew is the tax collector. You guys remember that story, right? Where Jesus calls him out from his tax collector booth. Matthew, come and follow me. And he does, and he did his whole life. And ended up writing the Gospel of Matthew. So it's a cool personal story that came out of the writing of the Gospel of Matthew. So keep in mind, as we get into these Gospels, it's good to know that for a long, long time after the resurrection of Jesus, these teachings of Jesus and these stories of Jesus were an oral tradition. Everything was an oral tradition back then, and so they got really, really good at telling and retelling the exact same story. Sometimes people think this is difficult, but remember, you've probably heard the same stories from maybe your dad or your grandpa or somebody, and they're told the exact same way every single time, and it gets a little monotonous. Well, that's how the stories with Jesus were told as well. They're told the same way again and again and again. They didn't feel the need to write it down immediately because, well, they thought he was coming right back, and so they didn't write anything down because why bother? And it wasn't until 30 or 40 years that Matthew decided, hey, listen, we should write some of this stuff down so that we have it preserved, because someday maybe this first generation of people who lived with him aren't going to be around anymore. And so we want to make sure to get the story straight for the next generation and the next generation. And in fact, that was so important that actually not Matthew, but four people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, also got together, wrote all these things down. So Matthew is like the collector or the editor of these stories, and he lays the stories out in a particular way to build his case that three things: Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus is the new Moses, we're coming up more on that in just a minute, and Jesus is God, not only God, but also God Emmanuel, God with us. All right, so you kind of imagine the book of Matthew having an introduction and then 5 main scenes and then a conclusion right after this. So let's just jump in to what we got here as the introduction. Introduction is in Matthew 1, 1 to 3. we see here, it's good to notice that Matthew is connecting Jesus to the Old Testament. So we start off Matthew 1 right off the bat with a genealogy. So Jesus is connected to Abram, and he's connected to David, and then Jesus is right in that line. We see the nations coming, bowing before him, this star of Bethlehem, right? This whole thing, God with us. It's all about fulfilling these Old Testament promises. Now, sometimes we see that Matthew is obviously concerned with this Jewish audience. He quotes the Old Testament more than anybody else. But he does that, guys, he does that because he's trying to cast Jesus as the better and true Moses. Like Moses was a figure that was a teacher and a leader, but Jesus is that preeminently. He is that forever and ever. He is the better and true Moses. So just some overlap. And I thought this was super cool. That Moses, remember, he led the people out of slavery in Egypt. That Moses crossed the Red Sea miraculously. That Moses supervised the people, led the people through their wilderness wandering, and that Moses received the law on Mount Sinai. These are all huge, huge themes in the Old Testament. Well, Jesus, remember, had to flee to Egypt because of the persecution of Herod when he was born. And so he comes up out of Egypt, just like the people did, just like Moses did. And that Jesus had to cross through, not the Red Sea, but the Jordan River where he was baptized right away in the book of Matthew. There was this wilderness temptation. Some of these stories seem like kind of strange the way they're put together like that. But like why are all of a sudden baptism and then Jesus in the wilderness being tempted? Well, keep in mind, Matthew's point is saying Jesus is deeply and profoundly connected to the Old Testament. All right, and Jesus gives the law. Not on Mount Sinai, but the Sermon on the Mount. Again, all casting Jesus as the better and true Moses. All right, he's greater than Moses, in fact. Okay, that's kind of all as introduction. Matthew's just laying it down. And then he kind of gets into the content, these 5 scenes. The first one is an announcement of the kingdom of God. Jesus comes right out of the gate, and he's confronting evil. He's restoring God's reign. He's creating this new family, asking people to follow him, called the church. And then in Matthew 4-7, they have the announcement of the Beatitudes. Hey, blessed are these categorical people. Blessed are happy are these people. And the key throughout the Sermon on the Mount is his teaching on, hey, divorce, you've heard that it was said, but I tell you, murder, you've heard, or anger, the commandments, you've heard that it was said, but I tell you, prayer, fasting, generosity, you've heard that it was said, but I tell you. He's not here to set these Old Testament aside, but he's saying, no, I'm right in that vein. Listen, I'm going to give you a deeper understanding of all of these things and so much more. Scene number 2, Jesus brings the kingdom into real life. This is not like an abstract deal for Jesus of like, oh, cool ideas, man. But for Jesus and for all of us who find ourselves following after him, this is the point of life. This is everything. This has real life implications. So we have these stories of a leper, a centurion servant, a sick mother, this calming the stormy seas, a demonized man, paralyzed man, the dead girl and the sick woman, a blind man and a mute man, all in these few chapters. It's like Jesus is saying, like, listen, you want to know if this makes an impact? You want to know if some of this makes a difference? I mean, I've got a dead girl who will tell you this faith makes a difference. I've got a pair of blind men that'll tell you this story makes a difference. A mute man who says now this story makes a difference. So Jesus is saying yes, and it applies to you too. So come and follow me. And at the end of this scene, he sends out the 12 to go expand the family of believers. But there's quite a bit of resistance, and that's scene number 3, where we have Matthew 11-13, this response to Jesus. And it kind of goes 3 ways, right? Positive, neutral, negative. The positive are people in the crowd. You're the Messiah. We want to forcibly install you as king. Neutral, John the Baptist and his followers. Hey, are you? Are you the Messiah? I don't know. And the negative, the Pharisees are going, he's not. He's an imposter. He's a lawbreaker. In fact, he's worse than all of that. Well, then Matthew follows that up with this set of parables that Jesus tells. And he kind of tells all these parables as a response to saying, listen, there's different ways of responding. The parable of the the farmer sowing the seed, the parable of the pearl, parable of the guy who finds a treasure in a field, sells everything to go out and get it for himself. In a sense, all of this is saying Jesus is going, not everybody is going to accept this message. I want them to, but not everybody will. And that's what those parables are about. Matthew 14:12 in the fourth scene is kind of the expectations on the Messiah. We got these dual stories of Jesus telling or feeding these huge crowds in the wilderness. Again, we hear these shouts of Moses, echoes of Moses coming through of feeding the people in the wilderness. Pharisees can't quite understand why Jesus would feel, especially the non-Jewish people in the second story. Anyway, they start to see the filling out these expectations of the Pharisees, start to see him as kind of like a Saul figure, as a conqueror figure, as a warrior leader figure who's supposed to defeat villains and not invite them in. And Jesus begins and he says, okay, let's clarify some of our expectations. So Jesus starts talking more Old Testament, Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. He starts talking about his kingdom, and it's upside down kind of ways. We gain honor actually by giving it away, by serving. We forgive instead of taking revenge. We gain true wealth by giving it away, especially to the poor. Like it doesn't quite make sense that to follow the Messiah, this kind of Messiah, you actually have to become a servant. Matthew 21:25, scene number 5 is the clash of the kingdoms, we call that. Jesus versus the Pharisees, right? This is when the rising action of the story really takes place, and then ultimately the climax of the story, the high point and low points, where Jesus comes into Jerusalem and he's riding on this donkey. He turns over these tables. He creates this scene. Jesus clashes up directly with the Pharisees by calling them hypocrites. He weeps over Jerusalem. He predicts his death. He predicts that the Pharisees are going to lead the people directly down this road of confrontation with Rome, and ultimately they'll get what they're asking for, a war, and Rome will come out on top, and that Jerusalem will be taken. And that's exactly what was happened historically. I think it was 78 AD. Rome came and did exactly that. Jesus was right. But we also see within those stories, the clash of kingdom is setting up for the conclusion of the matter, which is Jesus again having the Passover meal. Passover, we get Moses vibes all over there. He retells the story of the Passover lamb from Exodus, slaughtering the lamb, putting the blood on the doorpost, the angel of death passing over those households. But he rebrands the bread and the wine at that Passover meal as new symbols, but also old symbols. They're still symbols of slavery and freedom, but this time not of the Egyptians, but slavery and freedom of freedom from sin, or freedom from evil. And we see the passion narrative, Pilate, Pharisees, soldiers, all descending on Jesus. And we see that Jesus' death, Matthew casts it, Jesus' death was not a tragedy the way that Matthew tells it, right? Like if you believe that Jesus was that Saul kind of figure that the Pharisees were expecting the Messiah to be, the story would be written in the darkness of Jesus' death would be a failure. But it's not a failure. The way that Matthew writes about it is actually a fulfillment, a surprising fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. Even in that passion, that suffering narrative of Jesus, we still see him surprisingly following through exactly, precisely about those Old Testament prophecies. And then, of course, Jesus' body placed in a tomb, but surprise, he rises from the dead. There's that resurrection story that Jesus is back. And the story concludes by saying anybody can join this mission. And we've got these 3 criteria. He goes, number 1, be baptized, like cross through the seas. We see this Moses echo coming through. Obey the teaching that I have commanded you. Obey the teaching given on the mount, the Sermon on the Mount, not the Mount of Sinai necessarily. Again, Moses echoes. And he goes, surely I am with you always as the Emmanuel God. These themes carried through right in the very end, the conclusion of the story. All right, I hope that kind of helps you understand, I guess, a little bit about like what Matthew was about as a book of the Bible. I hope that when you read Matthew now, that you're looking for these Old Testament themes. When you are reading the Bible, reading Matthew, look up the Old Testament quotes in their context. Come back and you'll start to see this whole new world that Jesus was expanding onto. And then also just as you're reading through Matthew, pay attention to like who accepts Jesus, because it's fascinating, the people. It's not the people that you'd expect. It's usually the irreligious or the unimportant people who accept Jesus, and then their lives are transformed as a result. We're doing this thing where we kind of assign a key verse or maybe a memory verse in some of our groups on this context. Matthew 28 is an awesome one for that. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you on the Sermon on the Mount. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Spotting Jesus in Matthew. Obviously, he's a main character. But sometimes you go into like a hotel room or something, and you might see like a little Bible, like a Gideon Bible, and it's like just Psalms, Proverbs, and the New Testament. The Old Testament is cut off. Sometimes there's this temptation to become a New Testament or maybe like a red letter only Christian. Well, the problem with that is that Jesus wasn't a red letter only Christian. That Jesus found himself exactly in line with the Old Testament. There's this little quote here by Michael Williams, a professor that I had, and where some of this content comes from his book, The Jesus Lens. And I like this idea about how Jesus reinterprets the law of Moses by stripping the layers of paint that had been applied to it by the religious leaders and revealing its original beauty underneath. See, that's what happens all the time. When we talk about the law, we talk about the law in a way that's negative or that's constricting or that it's life-sucking. Well, that's the veneer, or that's the layers of that old paint that's been put on over top. Jesus came to strip all of that away, not to abolish that law, but actually to strip away the stuff that doesn't matter so that we can see the real beauty, the real character hidden just underneath all of it. That the law wasn't meant to fence life out, but actually to fence death out and maintain life as a garden that can continue on to describe it. Pretty profound stuff in the book of Matthew. Listen, I've got these reflection questions. I'm going to leave those on the screen here for a little bit so you can check those out on your own if you're in a small group conversation. These are great questions to use to kind of get this conversation jump-started. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys next week, Wednesday at noon, continuing that conversation on our book of